The following program is a UWTV classic.
An American Dream That Turned to Dust. Jonathan Raban on Badland, his award-winning book of imaginative nonfiction. Next on Upon Reflection.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Ross Reynolds. America loves winners and ignores losers. The myth of the American pioneers celebrates those who tamed the land, finding peace and stability. But there were many pioneers who did not succeed. Jonathan Raban tells one of those stories in Badland, his award-winning history of the settling and subsequent depopulation of eastern Montana at the early part of the century. Jonathan, thanks so much for being with us on Upon Reflection.
It's nice to be here.
The scene is really the end of the settling of the American West. The year is 1909, and yet another railroad company has some dreams to peddle to people in Europe and to the eastern part of the United States, and this dream revolves around eastern Montana.
Well, it really revolves not so much around eastern Montana as around this imaginary Elysium, this new Eden. The railroad companies, had to populate the land as they went along and moved rapidly west. And as the Milwaukee Road Railroad plowed across the North Dakota border into the flat, dry landscape of eastern Montana, it started to hire a gang of copywriters and picture painters who constructed pamphlets, wonderful, marvelous works of fiction, which portrayed the promised land, this green place of sort of winding lanes and corn growing, shoulder high and packed as close as the bristles on a brush. And these pamphlets were distributed everywhere. They went to the eastern cities, they went to tenements in New York, they went across the Atlantic, they found their way into little towns in Ireland, Sweden, Bessarabia, Denmark, England. In almost every depressed corner of the Western world, you could pick up a pamphlet reading about this amazing free gift. 320 acres, an almost inconceivable country estate in this green and pleasant land. And it was all for free. All you had to do was to fence it, build a house on it, and live there for 5 years. You needn't be an American citizen to claim it. It was irresistible.
They not only sold a fantasy landscape, they also sold a fantasy agricultural science, the science of dry farming.
Oh, I wish I brought it along, yeah. The little green book, the Bible of dry farming, called Campbell's Soil Culture Manual, written by the great prophet of the dry farming movement, Hardy Webster Campbell. And on it was demi-octavo, bound in green cloth significantly, green being an important color here. And on its front, it had a gilt camel stamped on the jacket. And across the camel's legs was trailed this banner. It read, "The camel for the Sahara Desert, the Campbell method for the American desert." And inside were wonderful kitchen table experiments, which in your London tenement, for instance, assured that you needed no prior farming experience to become a great dry farmer. You could play around on the kitchen table with jugs of water and things and learn the secrets of capillary attraction, which was Hardy Webster Campbell's great secret for how to turn entirely dry land into a permanent reservoir of moisture which would see you through the dry years and on which your crops would bloom. Well, it turned out to be hokum, but it was hokum with the imprimatur of the latest in science. And this, of course, was an age in which belief in science married to a belief in America and America's transforming powers was absolutely irresistible.
Immigrants have been sold a bill of goods throughout our history, but in this particular case, this dream of vast expanses of beautiful land and farming methods that would make them at least comfortable, if not well-to-do, all turned out to be false, and it wasn't more than a decade or two before people left that same land of eastern Montana.
Wasn't more than 7 years, really. They happened to arrive in a brief run of moist years. I mean, people say, I think, that the standard measure of whether land is farmable for the kind of mixed farming that the homesteaders were trying to do is about 15 inches of rainfall. Well, that part of eastern Montana sometimes gets 7 inches, sometimes it gets 18. And they happened to arrive in a run of years when the rain kept coming. And for a moment it looked as if the dream was coming true. Their crops did grow, their herds of cattle got established, and the bank managers moved in. Everybody wanted to get a share in the coming future of the New West. And as the bank managers moved in, roaming around the landscape, down the dust roads in their Model Ts, pressing low-interest loans on any homesteader who would take one, they were advising the tremendous benefits to be gained by getting a tractor, getting a threshing machine, getting one of the new mechanical gizmos. This was a very 20th century story. I mean, it's not a story of the Old West. It's a story about the science and technology enchanted West. And people bought into it. And very often I think people were as ruined eventually by the debt that the bank managers got them into as they were by the drought, which came in around 1917.
You have a section of the book where you talk about some of these mechanical wonders that were offered.
Oh yeah, they used to send away the farming magazines used to come every fortnight through the post, particularly a magazine called the Dakota Farmer, which was, as it were, the nearest to their own land. And these magazines were just full of ads for these most wonderful inventions of the agricultural 20th century. And I dug around through the magazines and produced this list of gizmos for homesteaders. The homesteaders who'd come to eastern Montana as a result of sending away for an illustrated pamphlet now filled in coupons, "Don't delay, mail today," in the weekly farmers' papers, where they were addressed by the advertisers as men of substance. More pamphlets came back, supplying further details of the grain-saving wind stacker, the Schmeisser leveler will work wonders on your farm, the Russell grain thresher, the improved junior revolving rod weeder, the biggest link in the chain of greater crop production, the Peoria drill, the Alpha power sprayer, the Dunham cultipacker, the busiest implement on the farm, the Aeromotor self-oiling windmill, the Fairbanks Morse 40-light F plant, one cost for light and power, the Great Western swivel hopper portable elevator and track loader, the Moline 10-foot grain binder, the Acme footlift weeder, the Holt side hill combined harvester. It cuts, threshes, and recleans your standing grain and delivers to sack or wagon at the rate of 30 to 60 acres a day. The Martin ditcher, grader, and terracer, the good old days of a pick and shovel have become memories. The Paypack cutter, throws as it blows, fills the highest silo. The American midget marvel mill, the one-man roller flour mill, the surest and most profitable business in the United States, and second in dignity only to banking. You can get into this money-making business with as little as $3,000. The Perfection Milker. Put your finger in the teat cup of the Perfection Milker. Notice how it applies a gentle, steady suction. Second, squeezes downward. And third, releases your finger from the suction. This is the same way of milking as that used by the calf. It is nature's way. No wonder the cow likes it. The Colfax loader, could you load 75 sacks of wheat in 12 minutes? The Wade pulverizer, the Litchfield lowdown spreader, and the Moline malleable frog.
I'll take 2 of each. Send them post-haste to my farm in eastern Montana. A great description, and of course the loans they had to take out to buy that was part of the crushing financial problems that they faced and what finally drove them from the land. You also describe in your book some wonderful photos taken by a woman by the name of Evelyn Cameron, who moved to that part of Montana. And
Evelyn Cameron interested me a lot because she came a little earlier than the homesteaders. She came, in fact, as a rancher. She came out from suburban London with her husband, and their great project was to raise polo ponies for the London polo market. I mean, you could get ponies on the Montana prairie at $5. The price for a polo pony back in England was around 400 guineas. a guinea being £1 and 1 shilling. Whereas $5 was, about £2. So you could turn £2 into £400.
Or so she thought.
One polo pony. Well, this is the kind of dream that animates people who come to the West. I mean, the dream of quick and easy money. And the polo pony gold mine looked as irresistible as the Homestead gold mine. She came out, they went broke. She fell in love with a camera and started taking pictures. And as a photographer, she was able to make a livelihood on the prairie, particularly when the homesteaders came, because first of all, she was employed to take photographs by the railroad companies to illustrate the wonderful pamphlets. So she became a rather good artificer of, the illusion of prosperity in the dry West. And also she took a lot of pictures of homesteaders' families, because the photographer was a key figure in Western society at that time. Whenever immigrants came out to the West, they wanted to prove that they were doing well, to show that they were all rightniks. And so, no sooner had you built your cabin on the prairie than you hired the services of a professional photographer to take your smiling picture that you could send back to the folks at home saying, we're doing well in America. And Evelyn made a decent living as a photographer out there. But she also brought this wonderfully estranged English home county's eye to the oddities of the Western landscape.
This photograph she made of one of the towns is extraordinary.
It is. What it captures is the strangeness of, how do you relate to a wide open space which has no trees in it to frame it, which obeys none of the ordinary laws of composition. How do you dispose yourself in it and not feel odd and awkward as you try and occupy a space which is obviously much too big? And Evelyn captures this brilliantly, I think, in this photograph. First of all, it's taken from an extremely odd angle. She's perched herself on top of a railroad car. She's too far away from the people she's photographed. She puts an immense space between herself and the people she's photographing. The townspeople, and this is, quote, downtown Fallon, which is just a little ways up the road from Ismay, Montana, also on the Milwaukee Road line. The people don't know how to put themselves. Either they sort of stand too close together or too far away. The buildings don't know how to relate to each other. It's a picture about disconnection and awkwardness and not knowing where to put yourself in the gigantic space of the open West. And it conveys, I think, brilliantly, that sense of complete disorientation, I think, that people felt as they first stepped out of the train and looked at this wilderness of shale and tufty grass and little low buttes going mile after mile after mile after mile. They'd expected the new Garden of Eden, and what they found was the dry and open West.
There's another extraordinary photo that in some ways reminded me of Diane Arbus photos. It's of a couple of the homesteaders standing outside their home, which you estimate could be no more than 10 feet by 10 feet on a side, a tiny little hut. When we were showing it earlier, someone said, well, that must have been one of their outhouses. No, this was their home. This is where they lived.
This was a claim shack, and here it's two proud owners. And it's a photograph with a tremendous sense of humor to it, I think, as Evelyn Cameron looks at this tiny house in an enormous landscape where the two chairs have been brought outside, and here obviously is, as it were, the front yard or the front garden, but it's also their living room. I mean, with a house that size, you need the open prairie as your living room. And here they are standing, again, in a very strange relationship to each other. Space between them. And you look at this house and it's so disproportionately small to the landscape. But look at this enormous doorway. It's a doorway for a giant. I mean, you fit the guy inside the doorway, and there's still about sort of 2 feet over his head. It's amazing. It's a doorway.
Looks so tall.
Only the doorway is commensurate with the size of the prairie.
It looks so high, though.
Yes,
also,
yes,
it's got a small floor plan, but it looks very high.
Well, she has this wonderful eye for space and the incongruities of space and relationship, and which is, I think, one of the great problems of the West.
Now, people are listening to your accent and hearing you describe this story, which you clearly have a lot vested in, and they may be wondering what it was that drew you to this sidelight, I would say, of American history, this smaller story of American history.
Well, I came out to live in Seattle in 1990, and like most modern immigrants, I just plopped here out of a 747 with no sense of how or why I'd come, really. I mean, I was just in a city with no sense of the logic, of why I was here, and I felt I lacked a history in the place. And when a friend of mine, who owns the little boatyard where I keep my boat just down the road, showed up one day with a very dog-eared looking manuscript, I thought, oh God, he's written a novel. He wants to know the name of my agent. My heart sank. But actually what it was the manuscript of a memoir written by his father in 1972, when his father had just turned 70, Percy Wollaston. And it was a description of growing up as a boy on a homestead in eastern Montana, where his parents had gone with high hopes and dreams, and indeed their dreams had turned to dust. And it introduced me to a moment in American history and a region in American geography, both of which I knew nothing at all about. And I read fascinated enough to instantly want to drive out to eastern Montana, which is a 1,000-mile drive from Seattle. And that's how things got started. And the original problem of the manuscript was, could it find a publisher? Well, at last it has found a publisher, and here it is, Homesteading by Percy Wollaston, available at all good bookstores, as they say.
With a forward by Jonathan Raban.
Price $20. So forget about the forward. It's Percy's book, but it's the book that got me going.
Mm-hmm. You also follow somewhat the story that happened after these people fled this land. They did not end their journey across America. Indeed, they kept going until they found something that worked for them.
As they left, there was only one direction in which to go, and that was west.
Mm-hmm.
East was expensive, west was cheap. Mm-hmm. They couldn't afford to move back east. They'd blown everything. They had no savings left. Many of them, in fact, got out of the country, literally riding the rails. I mean, they were that poor. And some of them, landed up as migrant workers, joining in the 1930s that great band of migrant workers moving out of the Dust Bowl, so they all got called Okies. Many would move west in small increments. They'd move to somewhere like Billings, Montana, and then they'd fail in Billings, and they'd move a bit further west, until they found somewhere green and pleasant where they did manage to settle down and finally at last succeed. But in many ways, I think the history of the West does tend to be a history of serial failure, of people moving west and failing, and moving a little further west and failing again, and so on, until finally they make good somewhere. And following the route out of the homesteaders is fascinating, because from my own Seattle house, I can now go out on the deck and know the route they took. I mean, I can look across the range of the Cascade Mountains, and figuratively speaking, I can see on a clear day at least as far back as Minneapolis. And if you take that route through the North Dakota Badlands, across the dry plains of eastern Montana, following the route of the homesteaders, over the Rocky Mountains, into the dry valley of the Columbia River, then climb at Wenatchee, you start climbing the Cascade Range, until finally you come over the top of the mountains and you see below you the green sweep of western Washington, the promised land, and not far along the road, the Emerald City. And it is, I mean, if I'm trying to conjure the Wizard of Oz, I think I'm doing it for a purpose. It is a Wizard of Oz story, and it reflects something too about the Wizard of Oz. If you think about the movie, the way in which Dorothy's dream is hatched in the dryness of a failing homestead in the West, and in which the Emerald City is, of course, a dream city that could only be constructed in the dry West and in the uncitified West. I mean, it's the Emerald City is her dream, because she's never known anything like a city before, and she's never known a world that's green. And I do like to think of Seattle as a version of Oz. It certainly was so to many of those homesteaders who had dreamed of green at the very beginning and had to live through so much dry and brown before they eventually made the coastal strip and found the green at last.
One of your strengths as a writer is that about things American is that you do approach it as an outsider and perhaps see the things that we don't particularly see. And there's a fascinating quote in this book where you talk about the story of the settling and depopulation of eastern Montana as a story that many Americans wouldn't even recognize as a story.
It was something that was said to me when I was writing the book by a Seattle friend, and she said, it's so American, and it's many Americans wouldn't recognize it as a story, because, you know, the right to fail in America is taken so for granted that Americans sort of assume failure. I mean, so, you know, they went broke in X and moved on to Y, and then went broke in Y and moved on to Z. I mean, that's so American, you don't even need to examine it.
But from a European perspective, that it wouldn't work that way.
Well, this is what I'd want to say about it, which is that I think so many of the homesteaders who themselves came from Europe, came indeed from, you know, within a mile or two of where I come from myself, came to the West with very un-Western expectations. In other words, they believed that they were coming out to this landscape in which they were going to put down roots and live forever. And when you visit that landscape now and find the remains of their houses, these houses are things of permanence. They were built to last. They were built for the grandchildren and the grandchildren's children. And people thought that they were founding a dynasty when they built a homestead. And that's the sort of European way. The American way is to treat the land lightly, and the classic Western community has always been the camp, you know, the logging camp, the mining camp, the cabin, which is a sort of temporary erection that, you know, you can just leave behind and move on to some other place. These immigrants didn't feel that way about land at all. They thought that land was permanent, and you stuck with the land, and you put your roots down, and you grew on the land, and you rooted yourself to it almost like a tree, and that you were going to be immovable. And that was part, for me, of the poignancy of the story, the expectation of permanence, which within 7 years became, for all except the very hardiest and most determined, and you know, most sort of plain cussed, really. That dream of permanence turned out to be a dream, and I think what I bring is a certain sort of European approach to land and the expectation of permanence that ownership of land means to a European. I mean, I'm always scandalized by how easy it is for Americans to buy and sell their houses, for instance. In England, it takes you about a year to buy or sell a house.
Well, they arrive in this land, and the promise of dry farming is a complete farce. The beautiful pictures in the brochures are completely inaccurate. They're just a pipe dream. And also something that you experienced firsthand from traveling in eastern Montana is that the weather is unbelievably harsh. I mean, I'm amazed sometimes here in western Washington to think of people living through the wet, sodden winters which we experience without heat, without electricity, without the comforts. But in eastern Montana, the winters could just be brutal. You actually walked through one of those.
The temperature regularly drops down to minus 40, and minus 70 is not unheard of in the winter. The summer droughts, which were in some ways more terrible because they were the things that ruined people, could be spectacular. I mean, you'd have a crop which was actually growing because there had been a bit of moisture, then you'd have a dry period, and then a thunderstorm would roll in over the plains, and your entire crop would be destroyed by hailstones big as golf balls. Quite a standard experience. I mean, hail insurance very often actually brought the homesteaders better rewards than the crops themselves. It was that bad. But the temperatures were unthinkable when you consider how people were living in tar paper shacks, these claim shacks that they had put up on their homesteads, and they were suffering 40 degrees below and burning everything just to stay alive. I mean, the story that most moved me in this was a family I know that out in eastern Montana. The guy's father and mother, he remembered as pulling up their fences. Now, the fences were the most important thing they were a huge labor to fence your land. The only way they could keep warm one winter was by pulling up their fences and burning the fence posts to keep themselves warm.
And putting up these fence posts in the first place was a huge effort. It was a long, day-long trip to the only place where there were trees that they could cut down to build into these fences.
Absolutely. And actually pulling them up must have been pretty much of a labor too. I mean, imagine trying to pull up a fence post in minus 40 degree cold in totally frozen soil. That would be a labor too.
Well, you also mentioned that the belief that America was almost a religion to people in Europe when they came. It sort of stood for more than just land. It stood for something almost spiritual. What was that?
I think it was the sense that America could miraculously transform you from, say, a poor man to a rich man, from a man without self-respect to a man bulging with, the 1990s most unfortunate commodity, high self-esteem. And this sense of the transforming power of America, in some ways, for a moment, sort of supplanted claims of religion. I mean, here it was, it was a secular religion. It was a religion whose paradisal fruits you could enjoy while you were still on earth, which beats most other kinds of religion. And it's remarkable that the society that they set up in the beginning was a notably secular society. It was a society that believed in education, believed in science, believed in technology, believed in all those 20th century goodies. And it's impressive to me, driving around that prairie, that the buildings that stand out, the real landmarks on the open prairie, are not churches and church towers, they're schools. They're these single-room schoolhouses that dominate the landscape of eastern Montana and North Dakota in a way that church towers dominate the landscape of England. And in many ways, for many of these people, it was an escape into a dawning age of reason and prosperity in which education was the great engine that would bring people to the new life in America.
Well, it's an extraordinary book. It's beautifully written, and it's called Badland. Jonathan Raban, I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today on Upon Reflection.
Thank you for having me.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.